Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, End of an Era, a Decade of DevOps Advancement and What to Expect in the 2020s. Before we begin, I'd like to cover a couple of housekeeping items for our viewers. First, at the bottom of your audience console, you'll find a number of widgets for questions and additional resources. When you have questions for the presenters during the webinar, click on the Q&A widget and submit your question. We'll answer as many questions as possible at the end of the webinar, and if we run out of time, we'll get back to you via email. Also, if you need any tech support during the webinar, please use the help option. Lastly, a copy of today's slide deck is available in the resources list on the right side of your console. You will also receive an email with a link to the recording of the webinar within the next few days. With that, I'll introduce our presenter for today's broadcast, Eran Kinsbruner, Chief Evangelist here at Perfecto by Perforce, and special guest presenter, Tariq King, Founder and CEO at Self-Test.io. Eran, thanks for joining us on today's broadcast.
Hey, thank you for the introduction, and welcome, Tariq, to this webinar. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, before I start with more detailed introduction, as we are kicking a new decade, I thought together with Tariq it would be a nice timing to do I would say, a wrap-up of what happened over the past decade, and a lot of things happened and actually changed the way we are doing testing and we are releasing software. But also things are evolving as we close 2019 towards the next decade that we wanted to highlight and maybe give you guys, the practitioners, some tools to prepare for what's evolving in the market. So as Shelby mentioned, my name is Eran Kinsbruner. I'm a chief evangelist and author at Perfecto by Perforce, blogger, speaker with almost, I would say, 20 years in the field of software development and testing with my own blog and Twitter handle, so feel free to reach out through all these channels. Tariq, would you able to, can you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, sure. Tariq King. As was mentioned, I just started my own company, Self-Test.io. Some buddies of mine and myself, we quit Ultimate Software to try to work on some exciting problems related to the future of software testing. So there's more of that to come in 2020. We haven't done our official marketing launch, so don't want to spoil too much. But yeah, formerly head of quality over at Ultimate Software, and I've done a lot in this space in terms of publishing papers and articles, and me and my buddy Jason Arbin at Test.ai co-founded the Artificial Intelligence for Software Testing Association back in 2017. So on Twitter, on LinkedIn, yeah, you can look me up.
Excellent. Yeah, actually, I'm a big fan. I'm following you. I'm seeing you in all of the conferences, and keep up the great work and contribution to the community. This is great stuff, and good luck in the new adventures.
Thank you.
So in our today's agenda, we tried and summarize a decade of software development and testing, where it was quite packed with a lot of things. We wanted to focus on the following agenda items. We wanted to focus, in my mind, on the most important thing that has evolved over that decade, and this was the shift from waterfall to Agile and DevOps. The transformation wasn't completed yet. We still see challenges, but definitely there was a huge advancement for many organizations across verticals in the shift towards the Agile and DevOps practices. We also have experienced a major digital transformation changes, both on the web, mobile, IoT, NFC, machine learning, AI, and others. Jason and myself will be sharing some of these changes and what's coming as well. We are also going to look at what's right now the hottest frameworks, tools, solutions that practitioners can pick up from, but also what's becoming more and more a standard in the industry for you to be familiar with. And lastly, we'll try to give some predictions, hopefully in 2030, when I will be doing the next webinar with Tariq, we can check ourselves and see if we got these predictions right. And as mentioned by Shelby, Q&A throughout the webinar and after as well. So, Tariq, are you ready? Let's kick it off.
Yeah, let's go.
Okay, so as mentioned, I wanted to start this webinar with the major transformation that we have seen, and this is the transition from waterfall to DevOps. Obviously, for those of you who are online and heard about waterfall, a decade ago, people that were talking about Agile and DevOps, actually there weren't that many that were talking in 2010 on Agile and DevOps and continuous testing. I don't think that continuous testing as a term was even existing back then. The majority of the organization that I was familiar with were very heavy on waterfall practices, siloed approach to development and testing and releasing software. Cycles took months, sometimes over a year. Everything was slow. The feedback was slow. Defects were detected late. Some of the features, up until they were released, weren't that relevant with the end user expectations. And a lot of that triggered the evolution of, Agile and DevOps towards releasing software faster in smaller chunks and with greater match to the user expectations. And what we have seen in my mind, a three-step evolution from the waterfall method of, discovering or the requirements gathering, designing of the software, development, and the testing through an agile approach, which was just about releasing software fast. It wasn't really aligned with the customer, not always aligned with the customer requirements, and not also aligned with quality expectations. And this is where DevOps matured towards a much holistic practice that looks at development of software, releasing it with high quality, very fast, with high value functionality that involves larger, or actually all of the practitioners. So if in the early days or in the early decade, the waterfall was, siloed in teams of QA, Dev, Ops, business, and so on. In today's DevOps, obviously, for those of you who are practicing it, you know that we are looking at squads and feature teams. Everyone is working together. You see a mixed team of developers, testers, business owners, product owners, and stuff like that, towards releasing a much more efficient software. Any insight on this transformation from you, Tariq? You have been out there as much as I was.
Yeah, no, I think, how you put it is right. Like, first we had a real focus on speed and trying to, react to change. But sometimes when you do that, quality really suffers. And moving into DevOps really tries to let us have a more holistic view of everything, try to keep quality up there. It's kind of like the bridge between moving fast and moving continuously and thinking about quality as we go on. And a trend that I've seen is automation, right, to enable a lot of that. So there's a lot of good stuff that has been happening in terms of that evolution. And I think that it's a very exciting time to kind of be thinking about software testing and quality with this evolution that we've seen take place.
Definitely. While we are saying that the DevOps took over the waterfall, if to look at the end of 2019 State of DevOps report from Google, this is how Google researchers looked at the most advanced elite practitioners in the DevOps space. And what they have seen is that elite mature customers that are embracing DevOps are able to deploy to production on demand and sometimes even multiple times a day. Okay, from a lead time for changes, they are able to address things less than a day. Time to restore service when you have an outage takes less than an hour. Change failure rate is between 0 and 15%. This is for the most advanced users, the ones that embraces DevOps, maybe the early adopters. And also it depends, by the way, on the software that is being developed, the software when it's developed in a monolithic approach versus microservices, if it's in the healthcare or other specific vertical that has a more lengthy and more dependent on certifications and stuff like that. Sometimes it impacts also the results. But on an average, this is how elite DevOps organizations perform. When the maturity is less advanced, like from an elite standpoint, look at the low performers. You can see here that it takes for the lead time for changes is between 1 month and 6 months. Kind of ties back to the waterfall model. But this is kind of a chart to map organizations on the DevOps maturity curve. But if you look at the reality in this exact same report, you actually see that while there was a slight advancement from 2018 to 2019, when they found 7% of the customers of the ones that were part of the research in the elite column. In 2019, the spike went up to 20%, but you can still see that around 44% of the organization are still struggling and are in the medium performing bucket, with 12% in the low. Okay, so we are looking at about over 60% of the market, if looking at averages, that are still trying to be DevOps ready, CI/CD ready, and this, going back to what Tariq was saying, also relies on automation, and automation doesn't only mean testing, automation of the entire software delivery cycle, from delivery, build acceptance, testing, and deployment to production, and stuff like that. So these are the results. Are you surprised, by the way, with this report, Tariq?
So hindsight is always 2020, not to pun on the year, but a little bit sometimes. I mean, I think that this trend really has taken off to try to get us into a better state of automation, as you said, automation of the entire process, and so that's why I think we see that 20% there. What is surprising is the low performer number is actually pretty low in 2019. So I think that's a great thing. I would have expected it to not even be so low in 2018, but it seems like a lot of people are in that middle ground.
Definitely. And I think that, as processes and the awareness to DevOps has matured, but also we have seen tooling, technologies, the combination of people, process, and technology being as like 3 pillars for embracing DevOps and being more successful. So I think the awareness also plays a nice factor in maturing DevOps embracement.
Yeah, I agree.
So let's see. Okay, this was just an overview of organization coming from the old waterfall through Agile and towards DevOps, but DevOps and software relating to what? So right now, I would like to transition and focus on the evolution of the platforms. And while I'm mostly going to focus here on the mobile and desktop web platforms, it doesn't mean that these are the only digital channels that have evolved over the past decade. In the healthcare industry, a lot of IoT devices, NFC, smart readers, smart credit cards, from Apple and stuff like that. So the digital transformation touched almost any vertical. I decided to focus on the mobile and web because I think that we have seen amazing transformation and also surprising changes over the past 10 years, starting with, the basic operating systems. If you would ask anyone in 2010, even 2011, what's going to happen in the upcoming years, no one would have guessed that Nokia, with the Symbian and other platform like BlackBerries, will disappear from the landscape, from the market. Keep in mind that a decade ago, Android was only at 13% market share. It was a very niche operating system for mobile devices. The major market was controlled by Nokia and the BlackBerries. Apple was obviously starting to rise as well. But it took a few years, a couple of years, up until we have seen Android and iOS really taking over the market towards replacing Nokia and other platforms. And by the way, as we close this decade, in late 2019, we started seeing foldable smartphones being released by Samsung and Huawei and Motorola and LG, with rumors of Apple releasing this year in 2020 their own foldable smartphone. And I've read a lot of blogs. I actually wrote my own set of blogs about foldable smartphones. And people were saying similar things as they were saying on Android a decade ago, that, yeah, this is just a trend that might disappear. No one will actually pay that amount of money for foldable smartphones. I won't predict that far away, but in my mind, foldable smartphones are going to become a standard platform. It might not replace all the traditional smartphones, but it will definitely become an equal citizen in the mobile space. This is just, some more statistics that I've gathered, again, on the mobile front, showing, how iOS and Android, this is just the road that the iOS and Android, Google and Apple did since the early 2007, 8, and 2010, obviously, up until they reached, the domination in the market that we are seeing today. And today, I would say Android is about 70 something percent of the market, and the remaining is iOS. In addition to the platforms, what we have also seen in the past decade, we have seen obviously that the mobile took over the web, and we've seen the traffic statistics, and you can track all the trends in the StatCounter website, but you have seen how mobile web traffic outgrew the desktop already in 2016, okay? And it's not just the traffic. We have also experienced in the last decade an evolution of new application types. Okay, the web application obviously there, and the mobile native application were mostly Symbian in the early decade, but then we started seeing more Android and iOS applications. We've started seeing hybrid applications, and in the late 2018, beginning of 2019, we started to see the embracement by many organizations with the support of Apple, Google, and Microsoft for PWS, for progressive web applications. And this is kind of closing the gap from a web standpoint on mobile specific features like push notifications and caching, offline caching, and other sensor support through web applications on a mobile device. So this is also something that evolved over the past decade, and actually is going to create, and also today, a challenge from many organizations that have this mix of applications. They have responsive web, they have native applications, and some are also considering moving to progressive. It just makes things a bit more complicated. An additional important fact is that today the failures in the digital channel are quite expensive. Okay, this is taken from the 2019, the recent Black Friday. And Costco is just one example. We also seen, I think, Kohl's and other enterprises, retail enterprises, that couldn't, cope with the heavy traffic on Black Friday. We see it recurring year over year. But the fact that it happens, it's one thing, and it's painful for the end users, but it's very painful also for the brand, not just from a reputation perspective, but also from a business perspective. This is an 11 million in sales that Costco might have lost when the outage occurred last Black Friday. So we also seen in the past decade the importance of digital user experience and the price when you cannot deliver upon the expectations of the end users. Any comment from you on that, Tariq, on the digital transformation before we move on?
Yeah, no, it's always interesting because performance, reliability, availability, all these things are all things that during the process we always say, well, these are important aspects of quality, but sometimes we tend to push these things to last, right? But these are the things that really hit the pockets of major retailers, major organizations, and so I think having a couple of these happen to close out the decade. Brings for a fresh look at like, hey, how can we really make sure that these things are at the front of our minds, the front of our process? How can we create more time to do things like performance, availability, and reliability testing versus just focusing on functionality, right? Because the cost is really, really high.
Definitely, and I've been hearing a lot in the recent few months on the importance of Dev APM ops. So everyone is talking about DevOps, but we have started seeing a lot of middle terms entering the DevOps pipeline, like DevSecOps, Dev Quality Ops, and Dev APM Ops. And this is exactly what you were mentioning, the application performance and monitoring for reliability, response time, availability of websites and mobile applications, especially in spike and rush hours or rush times events like Black Friday. So yeah, definitely things to look at in the upcoming decade and improve on.
Yep.
In addition to what happened, we also closing a decade with a lot of things that are evolving from almost a global deployment of new cellular network protocols with 5G, a new Microsoft browser, the Insider, the Microsoft Insider, which is based on Chrome, replacing the Edge browser. I mentioned progressive web. I also mentioned foldable smartphones, the smart cards and the payments. The voice assistant applications are becoming more and more, across the verticals, not just in the financial and support and retail, but also across other verticals. We've just learned, not just on iOS, but also on Android, that Espresso as a test automation framework is now also embracing security scanning through the Kaspersky add-on. So we are seeing a lot of awareness. We talked about Dev APM Ops, but I also mentioned DevSecOps. I think that Espresso is from Google is now trying to embrace the security inside the functionality testing through an add-on to their framework. So we should see more advancements also on the Android and iOS platforms in 2020 and beyond. IoT is definitely here to stay. A lot of advancements and technology changes happen on the IoT space, and we're starting to see it from smart homes to smart cities and other healthcare and medical devices. This is just going to become even more connected to other layers in our life. So definitely something to look into in the next decade and see how your own business can leverage such technology. If to look at what's out there today, and again, I'm just focusing on, as the title of this slide, I'm just focusing right now on the mobile and cross-browser or desktop web application testing landscape. These are the top frameworks that I am currently seeing mostly adopted, while we know that there are, I can list at least a dozen more. These are the most commonly used frameworks across mobile application, native mobile application testing and web. Selenium obviously continues another decade of dominance. It was also there in the early decade that just completed. Appium wasn't. It matured as iOS and Android evolved. Appium became the de facto standard for cross-platform application test automation, but it's now mostly relying and built on Espresso and XUI test. And if to not give a prediction, but also just to give a highlight on the relation between Appium and XUI and Espresso, this dependency might become maybe risky or painful in the future, because as the dependency grows, any changes, any roadmap that Google with Espresso and Apple with XUI will decide to take might cause or impact the Appium community. So definitely it's something to look at. Flutter, also supported by Google, is becoming also something that people are looking into as we closed the previous decade. It's not widely adopted yet, but it has a promise of a cross-platform development and testing solution. So it's worth just being familiar, at least at this stage, with this solution. Cypress.io, again, a cross-browser JavaScript test automation solution that is also becoming more and more widely adopted and maybe challenging Selenium after a decade of dominance. Tariq, are you seeing any additional, major frameworks? I know that there is Protractor and WebDriver.io on the web, but are you seeing any other things that worth mentioning on the framework side?
No, I think you got a lot of the major players, like you mentioned. There are some others like Protractor and those, but I think for the most part, we've seen especially this dominance still from Selenium and Appium on the web and mobile fronts. And it's expected. There's a big community behind it. There's a lot of major players that have invested in all of these frameworks. And once you have the backing of some of the major players like Google and so on and so forth, you want to make sure that the community is solid and happy. And so I think they've done a good job throughout 2019 to keep these frameworks. Of course, there's still room for improvement and people will still complain. But for the most part, we've seen a lot of support both from the community and from the more private sector in backing these frameworks.
Awesome. And before we move to the main topic of AI and machine learning that you're going to cover, I'm just highlighting, that Jonathan Leaps and your colleague Jason Arbon actually started contributing some AI machine learning capabilities into the Appium community. So it should be exciting to see how it's going to evolve in the next decade.
Yeah, it's very exciting, and we'll touch on that. So that's a good segue to the rise of AI and machine learning. I think in this decade, we've seen a lot of AI and machine learning being applied to software testing, and it's exciting. It's a lot of innovation that we're starting to see come up in the space. For the first time, we're starting seeing testing tools and some of our practices actually leap in front of developer tools, right, and developer practices. So it's pretty exciting. We've had quite a bit of focus in the testing world on manual testing. When I tell people that software testing is a manual effort, they usually look at me and say, oh, but wait, we have automation. Like we just talked about all those frameworks for web and mobile automation. But it's important to recognize that when you talk about automation, you're talking about taking the human activity out of the loop. And a lot of what we call test automation still involves this manual creation of test scripts, right? And so we're not really very automated. And, with AI and machine learning and its application to software testing, we've started to see this shift to like this grand dream of testing. Like, can we truly automate software testing processes and practices? And then also, is there space for, improving a lot of what we do through the use of these technologies? And so, we saw in this decade basically three general aspects of software testing using AI and machine learning. There's this idea of AI-driven testing where we're creating tools to actually do automated testing. And with that, there's also a lot of AI and machine learning being embedded into software, right? And so as a community, a quality-focused community, we're thinking about how do we actually test these AI and machine learning systems. And that's something that still is lagging behind, as testing usually is. And then there's a third intersecting area, which a lot of people don't really focus on. I think is probably something that's very forward-thinking. But as we start to think about the reliability of these systems and their dynamic nature, at some point we will have to look at how can we actually design these systems with capabilities that allow them to test themselves. So when we start talking about AI and machine learning and AI for software testing, there's quite a bit going on. And I think for the most part in 2019, we've seen a lot of focus on the AI-driven testing and a little bit of focus now coming up on testing AI systems. And so we really want to see if we can continue that trend and actually expand a little bit more. Eran, any thoughts that you have on the space as a whole and what you've seen out there in the market?
Definitely. I think that I'm seeing, and maybe if we have time, we can touch on that. I've seen a lot of confusion in our space when people are talking on testing and mentioning AI and machine learning. They are not always 100% clear on the differences between, what AI can do for testing versus what machine learning, or what's the role of AI versus machine learning in testing. Others are talking about self-testing and comparing it to, autonomous testing. Is it the same thing? So what I think, and your actually foundation, the AISTA, maybe it's the right place to actually, especially when we are entering a new decade, to clarify terms and make sure that no one is really reinventing the wheel and causing additional confusion, because as you just mentioned, there are very clear definition of things, and we need to be very clear about them. So this is one thought, if you can address that. The second thing is, why is AI and machine learning rising at the end of the decade? And maybe that's another question to you. Is it because of the adoption of DevOps, but still testing becoming or still being kind of an obstacle to a full CI/CD pipeline, or is it something else?
Yeah, I think that there's a combination of things, and you make very great points on positioning, everything in the space, bringing clarity to the space, and then more importantly, like why are we seeing this boom? When you start to think about everything that we've talked about thus far in terms of the digital transformation, in terms of the rise of DevOps and us needing to have, faster and a more powerful delivery, but with quality, I think there's also some gaps that this technology is helping to close. And I think if we start to look at some of the vendors that rose up within the decade, you'll start to get an idea of kind of why we're seeing this shift as well. We kind of saw within the last decade a lot of startups just trying to focus on how can we leverage this technology. And most of it has been around mobile and around digital stuff and trying to get features in there. A few others have been trying to target web, but there's still a lackluster of full-blown web and desktop-driven AI for testing approaches. And then even less we haven't really talked much about underneath the hood, right? A lot of these services and trying to tackle those and at the unit level and code-driven at the lower levels of testing. And so there's a lot of room still. And I think that once we started to see in this decade some interest and the technological advances that have come along with it, in terms of things like deep learning and a lot of the advances in reinforcement learning and different type of machine learning techniques, we're starting to see a lot of interest because there's just so much more room for this technology to grow. As we mentioned, there's a lot of these players that are building AI for testing features. My buddy Jason Arbin over at Test.ai, his focus is on trying to test the world's apps. Applitools is focused on some visual testing aspects, and the Pink Lion team is trying to bring a lot of this AI technology to teams in a practical way. Over at Perfecto, and you guys are in my former life, with your codeless automation strategies and looking at how can we just make test authoring a lot more simple. And so there's a lot of room for help, which is greatly needed in the software testing space that AI can bring. And we're only just beginning to realize that help. And that's why I think we're seeing this boom at the end of 2019.
And this is fantastic, and I can't even imagine, if you're talking in 5 or let's say 10 years from today, what would this slide look like, and where Selenium, Appium, and the other frameworks that are based on code without, the smart layer of AI and machine learning, where they will be in the, from a positioning standpoint. So this is quite exciting.
Yeah, that's right. And actually, you mentioned like in a few years what this slide would look like. And just over the past few years, I've been having to add to this slide and add to this slide. It seems like every week I get like a new company that spun up and so on and so forth. And one of the things that's also worth mentioning, and I think is also a contributing factor to our previous point on the confusion, is that sometimes there's a lot of marketing around this stuff, and it's not really that folks are deep into AI and machine learning in their products. And so you have to be aware of that. And I think that kind of adds to the confusion, because everyone is kind of claiming to have this technology and claiming to use it and using that as a means to pull potential customers in. And so I think like the clarity especially as we continue to grow on this slide, doubles or triples in the next few years, bringing that clarity becomes even more important.
Yeah, definitely.
So, we've seen a lot of approaches. If we just start to focus on AI-driven testing, we've seen a lot of approaches in the last decade. It kind of started off, a lot of companies in the beginning were looking at comparing application versions and doing this type of diff across builds and trying to recognize changes and classify those differences. So if you detected a change in an application, was it an intended change or was it a bug? And start to use machine learning classifiers to train on that information. As we also mentioned, there's this world of visual testing, right? Using a lot of the AI technologies around images and learning based on images to do things that we couldn't do in traditional automation, right? Try to validate the look and feel or the UI design or doing accessibility testing have been things that we have usually said, well, this is too hard for us to automate. But AI is now making that possible. There's a lot around specifying test intent that's making a lot of the test authoring a lot more simple, right? Instead of having a fine-grained test to say exactly how something is done, you can now specify, well, here's my intent. I want to check out some items from the shopping cart, right? And then the AI can kind of figure it out using autonomous agents to interpret using NLP or domain-specific languages to actually carry out that test intent. There's also a huge area on this idea of self-healing or auto-correcting tests, right? And maintenance has always been a big thing for us. Once we build automation, we got to maintain it. It just doesn't stop with the creation. And so you're seeing a lot of the players also try to look at ways that we can improve maintenance, improve robustness, have things like more stable selectors. You mentioned the open source project from Jonathan Lips and Jason Arbin. A lot of these things are targeted at just how can we have more stable automation using machine learning and also using some of that image-based lookup, right? And last but not least, you're seeing a lot of the analytics, root cause analysis, test selection, test prioritization, test flakiness. It becomes a big thing on how can we just use the information that's at our fingertips to do better testing, right? And so, there's many different approaches to doing it, and this is where sometimes it becomes fuzzy as to whether or not people are using AI and machine learning or they're just using some sort of analytics to improve decision-making. But it's a class worth mentioning as well.
I think that this is the previous slide is amazing in the sense that actually in today's digital transformation, as we spoke about it earlier, you probably need a mix or even all of these 5 pillars or approaches to release software fast and with high quality. You need a visual layer to make sure that you do not, jeopardize the user experience. You want the self-healing so you do not have that much flakiness. You do not see the flakiness if you don't have good visibility through analytics. So I think one complements the other here. So I really like this slide. It's very like an all-in-one.
Yeah, it kind of pulls a lot of the work, again, that we're seeing rise up. And the cool thing is that these things have just arisen kind of organically, I think. And you're right, it could be the driver, it could be a lot of the push towards this DevOps transformation.
Yeah.
So last but not least in the category, actually, probably one of the more important aspects of this space here in terms of AI-driven testing is more on the testing AI and machine learning systems, right? One of the first articles that popped up in 2020 was a Forbes article on how do you test AI systems. And again, we always know that testing usually lags behind other areas of development. And so, of course, we're building AI and machine learning systems. But a lot of questions are coming up. Well, how can we trust them, and what is the reliability of these systems, and how can we prevent bad things from happening? My buddy Jason also released an article on testing AI and bias, right? Bias is usually one of those topics that starts to get a lot of attention and controversy, right? But there's a lot of bias in AI. It's one of the things that makes it powerful, but it's also one of the things that can make it dangerous. And so we're going to see a lot of this happening. But just at the tail end of 2019, we started to see a lot more interest in this topic from folks, right? And a lot more conversations happening at conferences and a lot more articles. And so it's definitely a very important topic. So just a little bit on bias that we saw. One of the things to remember is that when it comes to AI machine learning, a lot of this technology is empowered by bias. And when I say bias, I mean that it is really a simulation of the human judgment, right? We want to have better movie recommendations, for example. And so how do you get better movie recommendations? Well, you start to learn what types of movies does my viewer like, right? And in that way, that is also a form of bias. But in terms of that problem, it's a good bias. It's kind of bias that we want. And so I usually try to get people to understand that when we think of this bias and testing these systems, think of bias as good and bad and not necessarily something that's right or wrong, right? It's more of a judgment, right? And of course, it can get ugly, right? We don't want to offend anyone or cross any lines that we shouldn't. And so we have to think about all the various types of bias in our training sets, in the labeling, in the raters, in the sourcing and the sampling of all of our different elements within our machine learning set. So testing and bias is really going to become something that I think we'll get more attention to as we move forward. And so let's talk a little bit about the trends. I think, we've seen already has begun where we're seeing AI machine learning enhance portions of existing tools, right? And that's kind of think where we are in terms of this space. And I think as we start to look forward, there's a lot that could happen, and we'll talk a little bit more specifics about the predictions. But I'm seeing that we will probably get to a place where we can not only enhance existing tools, but maybe replace entire tool stacks, but still need input from humans, right? And the cool thing about AI machine learning is that a lot of these things that might require input from humans are also things that we can train on. And so eventually, and this is where it starts to get a little bit scary for everyone, we may see that human activity get taken over, right? And a lot of things have happened in 2019 in terms of conversations. One of the most popular questions that I get from testers in the community is is AI going to take my job? Is it going to replace me? And so, even though we're still kind of covering our decade, this has been a big thing on people's minds within this decade, right? But I think that when we start to talk about actually seeing the realization of it, it's still some time away, and we'll see that. And even further out is where I think in terms of needing to have our testing technologies actually embedded in these types of systems, it really becomes something that I think will help us to cope with the fear that AI will do bad things, right? A lot of this stuff related to trusting this technology and security around these systems and different ways of hacking. A lot of these things will only be tackled by actually embedding testing and quality assurance tools within the systems themselves, right? And so, in 2020, we're going to be talking a lot about these topics at different conferences, both locally and internationally. So, just please check out any of the venues below if you want to continue looking at what will happen and what is progressing. Things are just moving so fast, Eran, as you know, in this space, that is hard to keep up. And so being plugged into the community, I know Perfecto, and I've seen you, and I think that's how I met you, was at one of these events probably a few years ago. So things are moving fast.
Oh, definitely. And I'm not going to miss at least half, if not more, than the conferences that you've just mentioned. So those of you online, I totally recommend to at least check a few of these. Epic is a new conference that's just starting in 2020, so definitely keep an eye.
Yes, most definitely. All right, so just to kind of round this out, I think, a big thing in 2019 that we saw this Gartner hype cycle for AI, and there's a lot of technologies and a lot of tools around AI, but we start to see this like innovation trigger, right, where a lot of the different pieces that are possibilities, we go through this phase of like, oh, wow, we can use this for this and we can use this for that, and you start to see a lot of the ideas coming up. But then, there becomes a peak of like those expectations, like, hey, well, like it can't do everything. And then let's start to actually think about like, well, if we use this stuff, we have to put some safeguards in place, right? And make sure that AI is explainable and think about things like that. And then you'll start to see like this trough, right? Of what is called disillusionment. I think, it's important to keep the hype cycle in our purview because it really correlates to things related to testing, right? Like there's a lot of quick and easy decisions that we can make within a second within our testing process that AI can handle. And we're seeing it handling it today. And I think a lot of those things that we've seen the vendors focus on are being tackled now and will continue to be tackled. And on the right, if we talk about what is, again, my buddy Jason, he gave a very thought-provoking keynote on the AI testing singularity. And some of these he likes to predict the future because, like, when you predict the future, you're not really held accountable right away, right? But we're probably going to see, this is where we align very well, us move from being able to tackle those very quick testing and quality related tasks to getting into those more thoughtful things that require, a little bit more, cognitive power, right? And then when you start to think about like some of the deep aspects of testing that require deep domain or contextual knowledge, that stuff is a bit further out. So I think the hype cycle and keeping that in mind in combination with thinking about the types of tasks that AI may be able to handle that relate to testing and quality will help us keep grounded about what happened in the last decade and probably where we need to go moving forward.
Definitely, Tariq. I think that as technology evolves and becomes smarter, continuous testing and test automation needs to be smarter as well. And these are just a few evidence and predictions of how AI will support the testing becoming more smarter.
Yes, indeed. And I couldn't leave a webinar like this without tackling one of the biggest things that I also get as a question. How can we actually start to prepare? Most people have this on their mind. They just want to understand what's out there. They also want to know, well, how it might impact them and just really kind of get their first, AI type of knowledge or machine learning experience under their belts, right? So there's a couple of things that you can check out. We've created a AI machine learning skills tutorial for the testing world. That's a combination, again, of myself and Jason. So you can see that and check that out at conferences. One of the best things, I think, to come out of 2019 that's worth a separate mention is Test Automation University. There's also a couple courses on there related to AI and testing and stuff. So kudos to Angie Jones and Applitools for that initiative. These are free courses all around test automation. Look for more to come probably in 2020, but please check those out. There's also obviously a lot of free content out there besides Test Automation University. If you're looking at pure AI machine learning, just look at YouTube. Andrew Ng and Lex Friedman have free courses on there on machine learning. That's a good start. There's a couple open source projects. Again, Test.ai and Appium teamed up. There's that. I know Applitools has like a API for their visual testing that you can check out. And while we were at Ultimate Software, we open sourced a couple of projects related to AI and machine learning and using autonomous agents, project called Agent. So check out the GitHub for those organizations, and you can see that. I always recommend also that people get hands-on experience. Like, it's great to look at courses and stuff like that, but really looking at those open source projects is good. There's also a couple sites that you can play around with this stuff. Teachable Machine with google.com. If you check that out, you can actually train a computer to recognize images, movements. It's just using, all it needs is your webcam, and you can actually sit down and kind of understand how machine learning works and try to trick the machine. And then Google has a AutoML Vision API that's also freely available for you to upload images, and it kind of helps you see how their machine learning models actually interpret these images and some of these things that they can detect, like emotion, or even looking at an application and seeing what are the different elements that are there and stuff like that. If you're looking to try to get your organization on board with this, the pinklion.ai team has been doing a lot to actually bring this to organizations. And so give them a shout. And Jennifer Bonin, who's been driving that, has really been all over trying to get this technology into people's hands, right? And seeing what is the right level right now for people to experience this. So take a look at that. And then, you have to follow this stuff. It is changing all the time. The OpenAI project is a good place to kind of follow what has been going on and some of the new technologies and advancements in AI. There's lots of blogs and different places that you can kind of look this stuff up. But there's definitely a lot of information out there to help us to prepare for a future where not only AI test software, but where AI is embedded in our software that we have to test, and maybe possibly one day when the systems are testing themselves.
That's awesome, Tariq. I think that, considering AI machine learning, especially in testing, is such a new topic. We see a lot of companies and vendors that are already trying to offer solutions, but also we're starting to see a lot of thought leadership and content for people to prepare, as the slide recommends, and get started with. So it's a very great opening of a new decade. So yeah, that's a very good table of contents for people who are thinking to get started with AI machine learning.
For sure.
So before we wrap this webinar, I just wanted, and I think Tariq mentioned in the AI machine learning approaches, one aspect which was the analysis or the test data analytics. I am actually a big supporter of the importance of embracing test data analytics. And what we have seen, especially as DevOps and continuous testing became standard, is that you're doing continuous testing. It means that you're testing at scale multiple times a day, and this generates tons of test data. If you're not able to make sense out of the data and get smarter decisions on whether to release software, whether to end of life a set of test cases, exclude flakiness and stuff like that, you're not getting the maximum value out of your testing activities. And this is what in Perfecto, we do have the codeless and other machine learning algorithms supporting our cloud lab solution, but also we have built an SDK, an open source SDK that is embracing machine learning to learn patterns in your test results and automatically provide you a root cause analysis, a failure reason, as you can see on that slide, whether it's a pop-up handling that caused the test to fail, a device that wasn't available, wrong elements used, security alerts, and many others, custom-made root cause analysis. And the main reason behind this development and trend is that you want to remove noise. You want to exclude as much noise as possible from your pipeline and only focus on pass and failures, real pass and real failures, without all the false negatives and other noise that might be related to your test environment. We have seen, in addition, and that's something that analytics can show you, the fact that, and we looked at the different approaches, and then I mentioned that it's a good recommendation to mix the different AI approaches and use, self-healing together with analytics and other test impact analysis approaches. But I also am looking at mixing and collaboration of test automation frameworks. We have mentioned, Appium and Selenium and Espresso and XUI test, Protractor. What we have seen, and BDD, by the way, what we have seen is that successful organizations that are embracing DevOps and have feature teams, they also have a set of varying skill set. We then see that when they are combining the skill sets based on their, combining the resources based on their skill set, they are able to use, tools like Espresso and Selenium and Appium and XUI test and others towards the same goal of high coverage with fast feedback towards releasing good software. So as we start a new decade, my recommendation is to see if you are maximizing the value that you're getting from different personas with different skill sets within your teams. And if not, see how you can match a test framework, whether it's BDD or ATDD based or a different language-based framework, Java or JavaScript, that will maximize the test automation coverage coming from as many practitioners in your team. Lastly, and again related to analytics, what we've also seen that as you're doing a lot of continuous testing and DevOps, we've seen in Perfecto that while Jenkins is the de facto CI server that people are using, without really getting good visibility into the different jobs and branches and the patterns across different builds, teams are not really maximizing the value from their CI pipeline, and they need a visibility, a good visibility layer. This is why within Perfecto, we actually developed a CI dashboard that inherits from Jenkins, but also gives you a set of insights and artifacts, including the trends, how much time on average took each job and whether it had any spikes or the time it takes to complete a job is going down, pass-fail ratio, and many more. And this is a very good productivity artifact for any DevOps organization. So just to summarize this set of 3 slides, analytics with machine learning and AI is a pillar that, in my mind, complements the entire test automation creation and execution. And this is why I actually wanted to summarize this webinar with the 4 pillars that Perfecto believes, and Tariq, feel free to keep me honest if you think that there is a missing one. We believe that if you have a good solution with machine learning and without machine learning that can support the entire creation across the skill set within the organization with a scalable execution layer of mobile, web, and other platforms, and then also a very robust layer of analytics, you are in a very good stage to start your next journey towards a new level of DevOps maturity. If some of these pillars are not used to the maximum extent or are missing in some organization, you will start to see, problems, slowdowns in your productivity. And this is actually how I actually differentiate between the 3 and the 1. So there are the 4 pillars, but I think that the left side of the house is where you are investing the time, the money, the resources and tools. But this is actually when you are getting the value back. This is when you understand if you did something right here or, whether you have places and room for improvement. This is how I see the 4 pillars, being set apart.
Yeah, I think that's great, Eran. Just one question for you on this. Where do you see monitoring fitting into all of this, right? We just talked a little bit about DevOps and monitoring and all that stuff. Where do you see that in your 4 pillars?
Oh, definitely. So I think that monitoring has 2 layers. You have production monitoring, you have synthetic monitoring, and real user monitoring. These are 2 different types of monitoring. I would say synthetic monitoring should fit on the left. should be part of the execution pre-production against as close as possible to the production environment, together with a real user environment monitoring, real user monitoring solution that gives you real end user data that goes back to the dashboards. At the end of the day, all of the insights, whether they are done pre-release and post-release, needs to go here into the analytics in a specific bucket that shows you what's going on from a response time, availability, performance, and other benchmarks that you think about.
It's great. I agree, 100%. Pre and post. So I guess monitoring is kind of, if you were to try to visualize it, there would be a separate little thing connecting the analysis and the execution, right? And monitoring fitting there.
Definitely. Yeah. And I think that today the market isn't 100% yet there. So that's another room for investment and improvement as well.
Great.
So let's just summarize. We haven't talked in this webinar even a word about Perfecto. So just to conclude this webinar, for those of you online who are not familiar with Perfecto, Perfecto is a smart continuous testing solution, a cloud-based solution for testing of native mobile applications as well as cross-browser testing. Your web, responsive web application, all done with a creation layer, an execution layer in the cloud with elasticity and burst capabilities. And at the end of the day, we also have a smart analytics, as I've just shown you in the previous slide, with a layer of support, engineering, training, and black belt experts. So check us out at perfecto.io if you like. And with that, Shelby, with the time that is left, let's try and grab a few questions from the audience.
All right. So the first question from the audience is, how do you see the mobile app testing practice evolving in the next years with foldable smartphones and PWAs becoming more and more popular?
Okay, that's a good question. And assuming, PWA is not going to go away, because we already seen a lot of, organizations, including eBay and Instagram and Twitter and many others already transitioning from responsive toward progressive. So definitely, I think that this is a trend that is becoming reality. Foldables are emerging, but as I mentioned in the early slides of this presentation, there are signs of changes, as we've seen, in the beginning of the previous decade, when Android was just 13% in 2010, and then it took over the other platforms. So definitely, we should not be surprised of an additional level of transformation in the digital space, foldable taking over, more traditional smartphones, progressive web becoming, head-to-head with native mobile applications and stuff like that. So my advice to you guys is to definitely keep an eye, as Tariq just mentioned, the world is prepared. Listen to what the market is showing you. See if there are changes that you can already do in your testing architecture and your platform architecture, so you are ready in case and when changes are happening. But definitely don't assume that what you have today is going to be good enough in the upcoming even 2 quarters. Things are changing. New platforms are being released every few weeks, so nothing stands still.
Yeah, Eran, I think a key part of this as well, as you mentioned, change, and as we talk about technology and we talk about AI and machine learning, is that you'll see it's not anything new. We have all these different types of platforms and different types of devices and differences in terms of the web application behavior based on some of the different operating systems and so on and so forth. That really, when you think about mobile, raising the level of abstraction is very important to be able to accommodate these changes. And I think that's where a lot of the AI-driven testing approaches shine. And I think you're going to see more and more. There's already a lot of activity around the mobile scene to test apps just using AI machine learning and using images. And one of the main reasons is that it can be more resilient and more robust as things change. So I think you definitely have to look at that. I know Perfecto, Test.ai, there's a lot of vendors that are integrating these features into their platform. And so I think we're going to see a lot more of these features rise to the forefront.
Definitely. Thanks, Tariq. Any other questions, Shelby?
Yes, the next one is there a recommended mix of tools that make a testing strategy better than others, especially for web and mobile app testing?
Wow, that's a good one, and it deserves a webinar on its own, I think. Tariq, you want to start with that? Do you have a point of view on that?
Yeah, I think that one of the core things that you will hear from any tester is that testing is really about mixing and matching different tools and techniques, right? And so I think that there's several tools. I think tools are designed to help you with particular tasks. And so whenever I think about this in terms of a problem, I think you need to start thinking about, well, what are you trying to achieve to have holistic view of the quality of this product? What tools do I need at the UI level? What tools do I need maybe at the middle tier? What tools do I need at the very base of my testing to have a very efficient and holistic view of the software to communicate risk, right? And so I think the important thing, as opposed to specific tools, is to make sure that you're getting your hands on the tools that are suited for the problem and the level of testing that you're trying to tackle, and also doing your due diligence to compare different tools that are out there and make sure it fits your needs. And if it doesn't, then try to move on to the next tool, or maybe it might require some innovation on your part to build something new or to start an initiative in the community to do that. So I think that's how I kind of view this type of challenge is, yes, there's Selenium, yes, there's Postman, there's lots of tools that you can choose from, but what is your strategy? And start there first and try to make sure it's holistic.
Definitely. I knew why I turned to you before I spoke, because you covered it all. I just want to add on that as a very minor comment. What Tariq just said is perfect, but continuously monitor. Even if you choose a mix that fits, the objectives as Tariq mentioned, and your skill set, and covers whatever you need right now, it might not be the case in 6 months' time. So Tariq showed us a slide on at least a dozen AI tools that are emerging, and is getting even every week is getting information on a new tool that is coming up. It doesn't mean that you need to chase each and every tool every time a new tool comes up, but you do want to be on the lookout if you're not getting maximum value from what you have right now, because technology evolved and the market evolved and stuff like that. So a mix that you selected isn't good forever. You want to put some milestones to revalidate and evaluate what you can maybe improve going forward. That's all.
Excellent point.
Any time for more questions, Shelby, or are we good?
Yeah, we have one quick last one. What should organizations do to mature their DevOps and CI/CD processes in the next 2 years, other than what was common so far?
I can start with that. I think, and we have seen, the percentage, and we've seen a very good ramp up over the previous decade with organization embracing DevOps and Agile. And I think we mentioned the connection between people, process, and technology. I mentioned earlier the word automation. I think that the maturity, and in almost any report that you would read around DevOps maturity, as much as you can automate everything around your software delivery, from build acceptance testing, test development, test creation, execution, monitoring and analysis, and stuff like that, test impact analysis, all of these automated tools, automated things that you can embrace and add into the pipeline will contribute to a higher degree of maturity in your DevOps. Because from a standpoint of feature development, developing in Java or JavaScript, I think this is quite known to the engineering team. They know how to write software, but how to automate and make it available to their end users in a very fast and efficient timeline, this is something that organization needs to improve on, and automation is still the key.
Yeah, I agree, Eran. I think, if you look at, there's a world quality report that gets released every year. It mentions that, automation is probably one of the single most important measures of maturity in an organization moving forward, especially. And I think the only thing that I would add there as well is that same report also mentions that AI and machine learning will be a force multiplier to your organization's automation. And so when you start to think about those two things together, a lot of these things that might be hard to automate, and I'm talking holistic automation, not just testing, but some of the things that might have been harder in the past to automate, AI and machine learning are now making them possible to actually automate. And so I think once you see those things come together, you can kind of measure where you're at in terms of your maturity model.
Totally. I think I've read a research showing that automating using AI is 6 times faster than without AI. So definitely that's a very important point for consideration. Good. So I think we reached the top of the hour, maybe even exceeded with a few seconds. But with that, I would like to thank all of you guys online that joined this webinar. Especially, I would like to thank you, Tariq, for joining and providing your smart insights to the audience.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was a pleasure, and very interesting and exciting year ahead of us. So I think we all need to stay focused on our past decade and what we have geared up for 2020.
Definitely. And I can't wait to see you in the upcoming events that you mentioned in later this year. So with that, I would like to wrap up this webinar. Thank everyone for joining, and we'll see you in the next webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you.